Here's a challenge for you. Go and ask 10 different people what William Shakespeare looked like, because I'm willing to bet you'll hear the same basic description 10 different times. He was a man with a long face, bald on top, sort of a frilly bit around the back, pointy little goatee, maybe a pencil-thin mustache. It's the iconic image of William Shakespeare. It's made its way into everything from sculpture to movies, from engravings to advertisements. It's everywhere the Bard goes. But why? Did he actually look like that? If not, what did he look like? Do we even know? Welcome back to my little corner of the library. My name's Dan, and today on Bookworm History, we're going to be diving into the various portraits and images of the Bard of Stratford-on-Avon. Now, we're going to run down a few different images today, most notably one sculpture, two paintings, and an engraving. First up is the sculpture. Now, mounted about halfway up the wall of Holy Trinity Church in Stratford-on-Avon, just above the tombs of William Shakespeare and his wife, Anne Hathaway, is what's come to be known as the Stratford bust. It was created by Gerard Johnson, probably sometime between 1616, when Shakespeare died, and 1623, when the first folio was published. And the reason we think that is because the bust is actually mentioned in a poem in the first folio's preface, written by Leonard Digges. Shakespeare, at length thy pious fellows give the world thy works by which outlive thy tomb. Thy name must, when that stone is rent, and time dissolves thy Stratford Monument, here we alive shall view thee still. So here we have an image that, while probably wasn't carved during Shakespeare's lifetime, was certainly carved shortly thereafter, and definitely seen by people who knew the man. So, hooray! We have an accurate depiction of what Shakespeare looked like. Except, nope, probably not. You see, while the sculpture was made shortly after Shakespeare's death, or at the very least within living memory of Shakespeare, it was carved out of limestone, and somewhat rudely done at that. The idea being that it was going to be painted to really show the detail. You see, between then and now, it's actually been repainted a total of 4 times. The first was in 1649, when it was just a bit of a touch-up. In 1746, it was completely repainted, and then in 1793, it was just painted entirely in white by a Shakespearean scholar who felt that it would have a more noble Roman appearance if it were just white. Apparently, this particular scholar was unaware that the Romans used to paint their statues in color, but be that no never mind to anybody. Finally, in 1861, the white paint was removed and it was completely repainted again. Now, there's 2 problems with that. One, 1861 is most definitely not within living memory of 1616, when Shakespeare died, and 2, when the white paint was removed, it was done using solvents, which were not kind to the rough limestone that the bust was carved out of. So, despite the fact that it's been repainted, it probably, by this point, looks absolutely nothing like what Shakespeare actually looked like. Next up, we come to the paintings. And while there are lots and lots of paintings purported to be of Shakespeare, scholars tend to focus on 2 when discussing pictures that date to Shakespeare's life or within living memory of Shakespeare, and that is the Cob Portrait or the Chandos Portrait. And just a little advance warning, this is where things can start to get a little bit heated and also a little bit murky. So while I'll talk about a few organizations and possibly their views on these portraits, I'm going to avoid mentioning specific scholars because this is kind of a heated ongoing debate, although the heated nature of it is kind of in that very proper elderly British kind of way. So I'll tend to shy away from that kind of thing because finger-wagging isn't really the purpose of this discussion. Now, the Cob Portrait is so named because it once belonged to Charles Cobb, the Archbishop of Dublin in the mid-18th century. Now, the story goes that Alex Cobb, his descendant and the painting's current owner, was at the National Portrait Gallery in London in 2006, viewing an exhibition of various portraits purported to be of William Shakespeare. And he saw one in particular, the Jansen portrait, which belongs to the Folger Library, which bore a remarkable similarity to a painting that he owned. So he wanted more information, and he took his painting to the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust. The Shakespeare Birthplace Trust took his painting, examined it for 3 years, and emerged in 2009 saying that it was absolutely a portrait of Shakespeare, and not only that, it was done from life, it is absolutely authentic, and they proceeded to have a very large exhibition with that portrait as the centerpiece. Some of their rationale for this conclusion: that the portrait contains the words Principum Amicitius, which is supposedly from Horace's Odes, and it's words that were addressed to a man who, among other things, was a playwright. They say that it bears the most similarities to the Droeshout Engraving. We'll get to that. Also, that the number of copies of the portrait mean that the sitter must have been a man of great renown, and that all of these copies have a very long oral tradition of being portraits of Shakespeare. Many other scholars, who possibly tellingly aren't trying to make a buck off of the Cob portrait, disagree with this conclusion and have their own theories as to why. According to the anti-Cobbs, the Cob portrait is actually a picture of Sir Thomas Overbury, who was involved in quite the salacious scandal in turn of the 17th century London, and his fame would explain the number of copies, including the Folgers Jansen portrait. As for the words from Horace, the common theory is that they were added later, as portraits from that era weren't usually emblazoned in such a manner, much less with an exclamation point, something which, by the way, does not appear in Horace, in which the words appear in the middle of a sentence. Also, the princely alliances of which the words refer to are actually being spoken of in Horace in something of a negative light. You're handling the civil wars since Metellus was consul. The causes, errors, and stages, fortune's game, and the heavy friendships of princes, and the unexpiated stain of blood over various weapons. A task that's filled with dangerous pitfalls, so that you're walking over embers hidden under the treacherous ashes. It just doesn't seem like the quote you would want to use if you were trying to honor William Shakespeare. But Sir Thomas Overbury, who got caught up in quite a bit of courtly intrigue, this would seem to make a little bit more sense. That's just my 2 cents, though. Now, the other painting usually championed as being Shakespeare either from life or from living memory is the so-called Chandos Portrait, named for the 3rd Duke of Chandos, although this theory too has its holes. Now, the provenance of the Chandos Portrait comes from the writings of George Vertue, who was writing in or around 1713, and at that time the painting was owned by Robert Keck, who was a wealthy lawyer and art collector. And if Vertue is to be believed, Keck was the painting's 4th owner. According to Vertue's first note on the painting, it was done by a man named Taylor, who was, as he writes, a player contemporary with Shakespeare and his intimate friend. Now, Taylor left the painting to William Davenant in his will, who in turn sold it to actor Thomas Barterton, who then sold it to Keck. So, in theory, we have a full provenance of the painting from 1713 all the way back to its creation, either during Shakespeare's life or afterwards, but certainly by someone who knew him. As for the artist, it's speculated that the painting was made by one of 2 men. Now, in his second note on the painting, Vertue specifically mentions that the painting was made by John Taylor. Now, there was an artist named John Taylor living about the time of Shakespeare's death, but there's no mention in his will of any bequest of a Shakespearean portrait. The alternative theory, and one that makes a little bit of sense if you take a little bit of an intuitive leap, is that the painting was made by a man named Joseph Taylor. The idea being that in the intervening 100 years between when Shakespeare died and when Vertue was writing, John, commonly abbreviated as J.O., was confused for Joseph, which is commonly abbreviated J.O. Was there a Joseph Taylor? As it turns out, there was. And not only was he an actor, he was an actor in The Kingsman. He's even mentioned in the first folio as being among the cast of Shakespeare's plays, so he certainly knew Shakespeare. If it was Joseph Taylor who painted the Chandos portrait, this would mean that it is a fairly accurate depiction of Shakespeare, made either during his lifetime or shortly after his death by someone who knew him personally. But again, this is all just speculation and a little bit of taking Vertue's word for it. Lastly, we come to the Droeshout Engraving, and what is arguably the most famous image of Shakespeare. First appearing in the first folio in 1623, the Droshot engraving was almost certainly not done from life. In fact, it's unlikely that the engraver had ever actually seen Shakespeare at all. The engraving was the work of one Martin Droeshout. Only to make things even more ambiguous, there were actually two engravers named Martin Droeshout working in London at the time. The first was a young man of about 15 years old when the first folio was published, and the second was the young man's uncle. It's generally argued that the younger Droeshout is the one responsible for the folio engraving. His lack of experience at such a young age might explain some of the engraving's inadequacies: the flat perspective, the two left arms, the large head floating atop a smaller torso, etc., etc., etc. It's typically thought that Droeshout was working from a life portrait of Shakespeare, although it's also theorized that that portrait, if this is the case, has probably been lost. As for how accurate it is, well, we're not really sure. The features somewhat resemble the Chandos Portrait. The attire is more similar to the Cob. The round face in the Droshot engraving more resembles the Stratford bust, although who knows how accurate that is. Ultimately, we're just not 100% sure what Shakespeare actually looked like. Even if one of these images was made from Shakespeare's life, it might have been, punched up a little bit to make the bard appear more refined and elegant than he actually was, and when that happens, a bit of accuracy is lost. While what Shakespeare looked like is certainly an interesting question from a scholarly perspective, what really matters, what continues to influence and affect people, is not his appearance, but the words that he wrote. And nowhere is this summed up better than in a poem that was published opposite the Droeshout engraving in the first folio of 1623. It was written by Shakespeare's friend and occasional rival, Ben Jonson. This figure that thou here seest put, it was for gentle Shakespeare cut, wherein the graver had a strife with nature to outdo the life. Oh, could he but have drawn his wit as well in brass as he hath hit his face, the print would then surpass all that ever was in brass. But since he cannot, reader, look not on his picture, but his book. Well, that's all I've got for you today. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Be sure to hit that subscribe button so you stay up to date on all of our latest episodes. As always, I'll leave some links to the sources that I used to put this video together down in the description below. Be sure to check out the blog over at bookwormhistory.com for all sorts of different articles and stories about a whole wide, eclectic range of topics. I'm really having a lot of fun putting all of this stuff together. I hope that you guys are enjoying it as much as I'm enjoying doing it. Again, be sure to hit that subscribe button. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much for stopping by, and I'll see you next time.